Welcome to Between the Lines. I'm Urszula Gacek and my guest today is Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. Minister, thank you very much for joining me today and thank you very much for hosting us in your home.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here. Minister, years ago you warned Western leaders about Vladimir Putin. Today, do you feel a sense of vindication or deeper frustration that it took a war to truly be heard?
I would have preferred not to have been vindicated in this way. Poland would be a more secure country if it had Western democratic countries on both sides of our border. Mm-hmm. And so, as the West and as Poland, we bent over backwards to try to help Russia choose a path of development and democracy. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin couldn't stay on that course because I think he tried at the very beginning. And then when he started invading neighbors, there's only one possible response, which is to try to deter him and to resist him.
We did actually back in 2008, 2009 with the then Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. You had a fantastic initiative, the Eastern Partnership. It actually built on a long tradition of Poland, of actually developed in the mid-20th century by Giedroyć in Paris in exile, which basically said that Poland's security depends on having secure and democratic neighbours. Then we were focused on Belarus, on Ukraine, on Georgia, Armenia, Moldova. Some of them have fallen by the wayside. What has happened to a project like that? Is that a project still relevant today when you look at Georgia, for example?
Sure, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
So first of all, remember that Jerzy Giedroyć was a man of the Second Polish Republic.
Yes.
And so it was quite revolutionary for him to argue after the war in Paris and among émigré circles that Poland should in future recognize the borders that were imposed on Central Europe by Stalin, essentially, and then try to establish normal relationships with peoples with whom we used to share statehood, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, and so on. And remember that this Promethean idea of helping our eastern neighbors become democracies was also accompanied with a desire, a dream perhaps, of having a more normalized relationship with Russia. There was a time, I would encourage you to read George Bush Jr.'s speech to Poland at Warsaw University in 2001, 3 months before 9/11, when the United States defined success as Europe whole and free, and by that they meant democratic Ukraine and Belarus. Much has happened since then.
Exactly.
Eastern Partnership was a Polish idea backed by Sweden, and to which Prime Minister Tusk persuaded all of the EU. A program of soft encouragements to countries of the former Soviet Union to adopt our standards, backed by real money, 1.5 billion euros per annum, to have more civilized border crossings, to have biometric passports, to have cross-border cultural and ecological initiatives, to have civil society come together.
That was an important component, the endowment for democracy, yes.
Of course. And it still exists, but as you say, some countries used Eastern Partnership to get closer to the EU and to become candidates, Ukraine and Moldova. Georgia was on the path to being a candidate and unfortunately has veered off. And some countries don't even try, don't even pretend to be on a convergence.
I think wasn't Azerbaijan in the original one as well?
But Belarus, sadly, also. Yes. But interesting things are happening in Central Asia, which is why at our initiative, TVP World, is developing new language services in the languages of the Caucasus and of Central Asia, and good luck with that.
Minister, let's go back to Russia and, of course, what is happening with Ukraine. There is some positive, apparently. Notes coming from the latest talks in Mar-a-Lago, they've been hailed as constructive. Anybody who's ever been a diplomat knows that that word hides many facets. But there are still no meaning concessions from Russia. Do you see anything that will bring Russia to the table?
What will bring Russia to the table is the further degradation of the Russian economy, so that Putin understands that he cannot possibly achieve his war aims by continuing the war. And he's not there yet. He still dreams of subjugating all of Ukraine, which is not achievable. If you look at the map of his military gains for last year, for which he paid with tens of thousands, possibly over 100,000 deaths of his soldiers, at this rate it would take him decades to conquer Ukraine. But this is the trouble with dictators, that once you've been in power for 20 years, there are very few people who will tell you like it is. And people only bring you the good news. So I believe that war will end the more pressure we pile on Putin, on the aggressor, not on the victim of aggression.
Exactly, but we are coming up to the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion and what will be the 20th round of EU sanctions. Every few months we have new sanctions. Is this a natural escalation that we started softer and we're going harder, or is it basically showing us that these sanctions are being bypassed, that they're not successful?
Yes and no, because some of the sanctions are an escalation. So, for example, the United States have sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil, good, and our European sanctions also cover new entities, but some of them need to be constantly updated. So let me give you an example. So we have sanctions on the so-called clunker fleet of tankers that help to export Russian oil. You constantly need to update the list, the names of tankers and the names of the captains and of crews. So even if we were not escalating sanctions, you would still need new rounds of them.
A difficult question. Poland, despite its frontline position and the scale of support we've given Ukraine in virtually every aspect, especially in military, in economy, in Polish society, we're currently not at the negotiating table with the US, with the French, the Germans and the British. And some criticise that and see it as a failure of Polish diplomacy. How would you answer such a criticism?
Actually, Prime Minister Tusk has just been to Berlin, where the meeting took place, and our national security advisors, as we speak, are in Kiev. All of the European ones, plus senior figures from the US. There are various formats. There are the European formats. In some of them, Europeans participate. In others, they don't. Yes, I mean, Poland has some arguments. We are not only the only member of NATO and EU that borders on both countries, and we are an indispensable logistical hub for supporting Ukraine. But on the other hand, as you know, the President of Poland has said that under no circumstances will he allow any Polish military presence in Ukraine, whereas the coalition of the willing is discussing precisely that. So there are these arguments for and against, including us in the various forums.
But there are also, I suspect, that the public opinion doesn't see it so often. There are some negotiations going on, for example, on the exchange of prisoners of war, things that maybe are not on the radar, but Poland is present at those talks, would you say?
Those actually are happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and in places like United Arab Emirates. During a war like that, you always have various channels of communications. There are channels through Turkey. China is involved. The UN, UAE that we've mentioned already. Poland's interests are that Ukraine should be sustained in the fight, which is why we've contributed to the purchase of American weapons for Ukraine. We are now, I'm losing count, on the 48th, I think, donation of equipment to Ukraine. But Ukraine is reciprocating by moving some of its production of drones and missiles to Poland. We are taking advantage of the SAFE mechanism of the EU, under which 44 billion euros will be spent on augmenting defense industry. Some projects will be done together with other European partners and also some with Ukraine. Much is going on. What is really important is that we have found a way to reassure Ukraine that her state functions and her defense budget will be sustained by the EU with a sum of $90 billion for the next 2 years. That, I think, is changing Putin's calculus. Because he may have hoped, as he did from the beginning, that, you know,
fatigue would set in.
Democracies are pathetic, democracies don't have the staying power. Now he has to be ready to fight for another 2 years. And that, and it's not clear that his army and his economy can bear that burden.
So in a way, helping Ukraine to be in many ways self-sufficient with the support of European partners, European funding, is key. I think Ukraine has experience of agreements which were not upheld going back to the time when the Soviet Union.
Well, this is one of my arguments in conversations with Western colleagues. You know, the list of agreements where West Europeans decide above the heads of Central and Eastern Europe is a long and a very unhappy one. And we know what they are. The latest ones, of course, were Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and we don't need a Minsk 3. But yes, Ukraine needed the money to fully produce in their own factories, in the unoccupied parts of Ukraine, their own equipment and ammunition. And we have much to learn from Ukraine because they have the experience of fighting a modern state-to-state war. We were preparing our army for 20 years to fight expeditionary war, and now we have to face reality.
Let's go across the Atlantic. The latest national security strategy that came out of the White House at the end of last year, I think there was maybe some sensational reporting that this was abandoning Europe, that there was American interference in how we run our continent. Is it as bad as that? How would you...
I actually appreciate the fact that the US produced a document that is hyper-realistic, that is more, you might say, more honest as regards America's actual capabilities. You know, they've been telling us for a long time that they no longer have the capacity to fight two major wars at the same time. And now that they've crossed the T's and they've dotted the I's. There are some provocative ideological statements in that too, which has woken up Europe. What we will have to follow up is the national defense strategy, where they will say how many troops they want in Europe. And that is, in a sense, more important, certainly for us. And every indication that we are getting in Poland is that the US is not only maintaining its posture here, but actually preparing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in US facilities in Poland.
It's actually good business at the moment.
Well, the US has a very favorable status of forces agreement. We contribute about $15,000 per soldier per annum, which, you know, this is our argument, and it's true. It is cheaper for the US to keep a US soldier and to exercise him or her in Poland than in the US. That's mutually advantageous. So let's wait for that, and then for the posture review. I don't believe that the US will withdraw from Europe altogether.
But
it will be a different kind of alliance. The US is signaling to us, you need to take care of the majority of the burden of conventional defense in Europe, and we will support you from over the horizon with the nuclear umbrella and the targeting and intelligence and enablers such as mid-air refueling. And that might be a new type of alliance which might be more sustainable for the long run. You know, let's give credit where credit is due. President Trump was right, right at the beginning, during his first term, when he said that Europe had been consuming the peace dividend for too long, and we've heard him, and we've doubled our spending since then.
Is this the new normal then? Is this the new normal in transatlantic relations? Because we're looking, even now, maybe to the midterms that are coming up at the end of this year. It's possible that the House of Representatives will flip back to the Democrats. Some experts say that it might even be possible that the Senate might go into Democratic hands. Unlikely, but possible. Would you imagine if, for example, the House flips and Trump doesn't have Congress behind him, whether you would see a change in strategy on this front, or is this actually the new normal that will extend beyond the Trump administration?
My argument is different. Irrespective of who wins this year or the presidential
or in
the
2
US,
years, yeah.
we need to do what we need to do, which is to rebuild our defense industry, to rebuild our militaries. Poland is ahead of the curve, but I'm talking about most of Europe, so as to be able to deter Putin irrespective of what the United States does. Because intention is one thing, and the US has given us notice, but capability is another. If the US gets involved in a war in Asia, and we cannot exclude that, it might not be capable of helping us. And so we have till the end of the decade to build the kind of military that Putin will be reluctant to challenge. And it shouldn't be beyond our capacity. We know our economy is 9-10 times bigger, I'm talking about the EU, than Russia. And we fought Russia successfully before the United States existed. So we should be capable of doing it today.
You mentioned Asia. Minister, I'd like to refer to a statement you made in Strasbourg as a member of the European Parliament in 2023 on China. We have two red lines: don't arm Russia and don't attack Taiwan. Have they crossed the first line, and are they flirting with the second?
They have not crossed the first line. This, I haven't changed my view. I have frank discussions with my Chinese colleague. And during one of them, he told me, rather wittily, I thought, that if they, China, were helping Russia with the war, as much as we Europeans say, the war would be over by now. China has supplied Russia with all kinds of goods, including dual-use goods, but not actual lethal arms. And on Taiwan, this is a Chinese declared national security objective. Poland has a one China doctrine. We don't prejudge. We say there is one China, but we don't prejudge.
So rather like Nixon and
prevails.
Kissinger back, I think, when the term is the famous diplomatic phrase of a constructive ambiguity was formed, where you have a document where both Taiwan and China came happy from that discussion when Nixon went to China with Kissinger. Do you worry that when we actually have some kind of agreement, hopefully, that will end the war in Ukraine, do you think it'll be robust enough? Do you think there will be a temptation to make it ambiguous in some way so that everybody goes away from the negotiating table happy, but we end up with some kind of frozen conflict that might rumble on for years or even decades?
I do worry about that, because we need the war to end with a Ukraine that is not only free to integrate with the European Union, but also has to have defensible borders. Otherwise, it's a recipe for another war some years down the line.
Just kicking the can down the road, basically.
Franco-Prussian War ended with Germany controlling land on the western side of the Rhine. It had to lead to another war, and it did. And so we don't want to repeat that mistake. But we will get a fair solution only once Russian elites have concluded that the original invasion was a mistake and that the aim of rebuilding the Russian Empire is unachievable.
So there's no face-saving option for Putin?
Well, Putin probably thinks that by demanding only Donbass, he's making a concession. But of course, that's that means that the aggressor would be rewarded. And the Ukrainians, I think now that they have this 90 billion, are determined to fight on, to resist.
May I ask a personal question, maybe to wrap up? Oxford University has educated many world leaders. You arrived there as
some very good journalists too.
as a fresh-faced 19-year-old back in the early 80s. Did you imagine that one day you'd join their ranks?
What I didn't imagine is that there would be a world in which Poland would be a very successful member of the EU with a very successful economy, and Britain wouldn't be a member. I remember my time at Oxford with great sentiment. And I think the Polish-British relationship is excellent.
Minister, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be here in your home, and we look forward to seeing your next speech at the UN, which I think went viral.
Well, next month is my speech to the Polish Parliament, and it's going to be it's my 10th, and it's going to be the hardest ever.
So watch this space.
Please do.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you.